Hi, everybody. My name is Kat Van Willingen. I am the Research and Projects Advisor with ACWS, and I will be delivering today's webinar training looking at ways to improve data entry through form design. So I have Jade from the Edmonton office on the line to help for the next 15 minutes or so with any sound or login issues you have. So please either send us a question or leave a comment in the chat room if you need a bit of assistance, and we'll work out how to get your concern sorted. And then otherwise it'll just be me on the line today, so I'll be fielding questions and providing the training, and we'll probably be taking more frequent breaks than we usually do to address questions, just to make sure that I don't leave anything or anyone hanging too long. So here we go. And sorry. Okay, so for those of you who haven't attended a session with us before, I'm just going to review the format with you and just give you a sense of sort of how the flow goes. So at the moment, I have muted all of your microphones or phones, so that's just to sort of address feedback issues that we've had when we've got a lot of people signed into one of these sessions. But I can unmute if you guys want to share any comments or ask any questions. Instead of typing, just let me know and I can unmute you and we can have more of a conversation. But I'll probably do that one at a time, just to manage, again, the sound and the feedback that we often get on these sessions. So I already mentioned questions and comments are welcome throughout the presentation, and then I'll just be taking breaks to keep on top of those. Hopefully all your questions are answered in a timely manner. And then just another point too, for those of you who may be furiously taking notes, we will also be recording the session, and we manage a member support YouTube channel. So all of the webinar videos that we deliver will be posted there and available to you if you want to go back and review a section that we've covered. Sometimes it's easier to focus while you're on the webinar today and then go back and update your notes later on. So you'll have that option. And Christoph is off for the next few days. He's the one who does who uploads the videos. So I suspect by the end of next week we should have this video available, and we'll send you an email to let you know when it is. Okay. So a copy of this presentation is available to you in the handout section, and you can see that that's highlighted down here at the bottom of your GoToWebinar pop-up. And then the questions area is also highlighted for you. So that's probably the best place to share your questions. It's really easy for me to track which questions have been answered and which ones haven't when you use this questions box. Okay. So an overview for you of what we're covering today. So I'm attempting today to do a little bit more of an interactive session. So what I'm hoping you'll walk away from in doing it this way is an environment within your outcome tracker site that you can try out new features on forms and activities in a way that doesn't interfere with any of your existing forms and activities. So it can sort of, you can freely use this environment to test without any concern about what might happen to your reports or your other data entry tools. So there's sort of two main themes that we'll be reviewing form features under. We have ways that make data entry easier. So these focus more on ways you can lay out your form that encourage data entry or support data entry from a user's perspective. So we'll cover ways to display questions, ways to display drop-downs, ways to add help text for users, and then also a few simple form actions that can automate data entry that's always answered in a consistent way. So setting up default values, that type of thing. Now, the other main area we'll look at are ways that we can prevent data entry errors. So some of those features include required fields, displaying alerts on important questions, displaying instructions on important questions, form actions, and these will be familiar to you because we have a few of these on our standard forms already, but form actions are essentially business rules that can hide or display questions, and they can also put rules around how certain questions get answered. So a good example of that would be a score in a certain field can't exceed, a certain number. So there's a maximum score of 10 that can be entered into a given field. Okay, and so as we review all of these tools, a few things I'll focus on and would like us to have a bit more of a conversation around as well is like, what are the pros and cons of each tool? So I would say, as with anything, there are some circumstances where one tool is probably more appropriate than the other, and so I'm hoping as we review them that becomes sort of apparent that, this is a great situation to use this tool in, but maybe in another situation, another tool is better suited. So I'll be highlighting the pros and cons of each as we review them. I also would like to focus on some of the factors that are important to think about when choosing these features or tools. So anytime we're making changes in the database, it's really important that those changes are grounded in a clear understanding of what your data entry issue or goal is. Sometimes it seems like the issue is one thing, but it could actually be, the source of the issue could be, more of a training issue or more of a definitions issue than anything. So I think taking into consideration a number of factors will really help you kind of do it once and do it right, as opposed to trying things out and having to redo them because your goals weren't clear from the outset. There are some forms and some form features that I'm going to point out while we're in the form. So I'm going to give you guys just an overview of the form and some other features that are available there. So they're not necessarily to improve data entry, but they might just be helpful for you to know a little bit about, so that if you want to explore them more with OT support at ACWS, you have a point of reference to start those conversations with us. And of course, we will always touch on features that would impact the shared data set. So ACWS facilitates shared measurement practices with shelters across Alberta. So that means that we've got a few questions in the system that everyone has agreed to collect in a standard way to help us talk about the work that we do at the provincial scale. And then there are just some features that can't be changed in the database that make us that process of rolling everybody's data up together. There are features that make that possible, and so if those features are changed, they can be disruptive to how our network performs. So we're going to touch on that. And then I'm hoping that there's time that we can work through some examples that you've experienced in your shelter as just sort of some, real world context concerns that other shelters can learn from and maybe adapt to work in their shelter site as well. So I hope that, what we touch on today, I've been working with shelters for 4 years now, so hopefully the examples I have will feel relevant, but it's always helpful, I think, to share kind of what's happening for each of you as well. So yeah, so that's what we are going to tackle, and then I'll just highlight too what our goals are, because really the intent for this session is that you'll walk away with an environment created in your site where you can test out the changes we're discussing without impacting your data, that you're more aware of the features on the form. So I should make it very clear that because you've attended this training, we're not expecting that you will no longer reach out to OT support with any of these issues. A lot of this work is still very complicated, and we're only going to probably scratch the surface of what is possible. So what I'm hoping to do is at least present you with a sampler of some features that you can explore and even pursue with us, and hopefully you just have more information about each of the features that will help you decide in working with us what is most appropriate for your site and for your staff. So. Yep, also that you have a better understanding of the pros and cons of each feature. And again, yeah, you can assess the options that best meet your needs, and that it's clear when consultation with ACWS is required. And again, that's just speaking to having an awareness of what is standard to our network in your site, and so what can't necessarily be changed without just touching base with us first. Okay, so we're going to hop into Outcome Tracker. And we're going to take this part nice and slow, because I'm hoping for those of you that do have access to Outcome Tracker right now, that you will work with me. So what I'll do is I'll go through a step, give you guys a little bit of a break to do the step yourself. But what we're going to do is create a test form in your site that you can play around in. So let's just go to Outcome Tracker. So I'm in Outcome Tracker, and I'm going to open the Activities tab up at the top. And over to the right, there is the option to define a new activity. And so I'm going to define a new activity. So when you define a new activity, you have the option to create, and I should clarify, so an activity is essentially a repository for data. So when we create a new assessment tool, we're creating an activity in Outcome Tracker to store the data for that assessment tool. And we would design it to meet all of our data collection needs, but it's sort of the storage and collection area for a data set. So when we create an activity, we have the option to create a new activity from scratch, or we have the option to copy from a template. And in this case, I encourage you guys to copy from a template, because what it does is it allows you to copy over existing forms and then play around with those forms. So I think what I'm going to do is create a copy activity from the case notes activity in my case, because there's a lot of questions there, a lot of variety in questions that will be great to play around with when we're testing. But again, we're creating a copy of this, so it's not going to impact your existing case note activity. You're just copying over those questions into a new space where you can play around with them a little bit. So I've selected case notes. I'm going to click next. So here I have to give the activity a name. So right now it's called case notes. What I'm going to call this is CAPS Sandbox, my play environment. And I'm going to just note down here that I want to copy the questions and copy the forms that are associated with this activity. And I'm going to click Create. Okay, so let's pause here for a few. I'll give you guys about a minute to set that up yourselves in case you were following along. And maybe as you're doing that, feel free to go into your web browser, but I'll just walk you through the process again while you're doing that. So we're going to go to the Activities tab, the High Level Activities tab. We're going to look at the tasks available to us in the Activities tab and select Define a New Activity. From within the pop-up, we are going to open up the drop-down list and copy from an existing activity. So I selected case notes. If you guys have a preference to select something else, that's great, but it probably makes sense to follow along with, the same tools that we're all going to be working from. So just select what you want to copy from, click next, update the activity name. So you'll need to give it a new name that's distinct from any other names that are already given to activities in your site, and then ensure that you are copying over the questions and the forms as well. And there are 2 tick boxes at the bottom of this pop-up where you can do that, and then just hit create activity when you're done. So I'm just going to check in now and see if any questions have come up in that process, and make sure everybody's set up to follow along who wishes to. So if you have any issues, please shoot me a question, and I'll do my best to help you out as quickly as possible. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the activity that I was created. I'm sure it's already open for those of you who have created it, and I'm just going to look at, you'll see a number of forms or a number of tabs in here. And I'm going to go to the Forms tab. And you can see that the form that's associated with the Case Notes tab is already here. And I'm going to click on it because what I want to do is, again, as part of this process, is just give it a distinct name that's different from the names of the other tabs that are already available in our site. So all of your tabs will have a form name associated with it, and we want this one to be distinct as well. So right now, you'll see when you click on Case Notes that the form features and options will expand, and you'll see a big list along the left here of different sort of sections of that form that can be customized. And I'm going to go to the Form Details option and just update the form name, which is the first option at the top. So we're going to call this Cats Sandbox as well. And down at the bottom, I'm going to click Save. So I'll just walk through that process one more time for those of you that were watching and want to tackle it yourself. So you'll open up the activity you've just created if it's not open already. You'll select it from the list of all the activities in your site. From the available tabs within that activity, you'll go to the Forms tab. Select the form that is available and update the form name in that first field, text field at the top of the form called Form Name. Give it whatever name you like and then click Save. And I guess I'll say maybe not whatever name you like, but any unique name that doesn't already exist in your site that is appropriate. Okay. So we've sort of set up the activity form side of things, and now what we need to set up is how this will display in your site so that you can see the changes that you're testing when you're working on this form. So that's going to happen over on the Setup tab. So I'm going to open up the Setup tab. And my work over here is going to be focused on the people organizations section here. And I'm going to define a tab, a new tab. That will display the form that I just created on my copied activity. So what you have to do is all the tabs that are available on your site will be listed here. And then down at the bottom, you have the option to add a tab. And so I'm going to add a tab. And just to be consistent, I'm going to call this Cat's Sandbox once again. And at the bottom, there's a drop-down called component, and this is where we assign kind of a type to the tab. And for this tab, we're creating a form tab. So from that drop-down list, I will select a form and click Add. Okay. So here we are. So there are a couple of steps now within our tab, the final steps that we need to set this up. So we can see that the component is selected. We've already done that. But what we need to do now is to pick the form that we want to be populating on this tab. So you click on Configure the Data Entry Form. At the top of the list, there's a big drop down that's going to pull up essentially the first name you'll see is the name of the activity, and it'll be displayed in alphabetical order. And so I'm looking for Cat Sandbox, and the form I'm looking for is Cat Sandbox. Now, if I had multiple forms within this activity, they would all list here, so you can see for the admission intake form, there's a whole bunch there. So it's really important that your form is given a clear, distinct name when you're creating it, and then we just select that. And that's all we have to do. Just click Save. So you'll notice we got a bit of a pop-up at the top. It says, warning, this tab is not configured to display anywhere. And what that refers to is this section here. So we can choose to show a tab on all organizations, show a tab on all people, or we can select specific roles that we want to display it on. So this is where I'm going to ask for a bit of input from you guys. So when I get to this stage of things, I'm very comfortable in my site and have been in other sites I've worked with, is to just assign my test tabs to the staff role. And that's typically because staff aren't always managing information on their own records, but that may be different in your case. So most staff in the sites I've worked in aren't looking up their own name or tracking any data for themselves. Their name is just in there as a staff person, so that they have a user account, so that they show up on staff drop-down lists, that type of thing, but they're not necessarily completing data entry for themselves on their record. So with that in mind, I usually choose the staff role, and then I use my own record as kind of a test record, or I create a test record using the staff role where I can test out data. Now, if that doesn't work for you guys, I can show you how to set up a new role in your site, but I just need somebody to let me know that that's what you want to do. Otherwise, I'm going to proceed with just using the staff role as kind of our testing environment. So please send me a message in the next couple of minutes, and I can go through that process as well. But for the time being, I'm just going to, from the role list here, select staff and click update. Okay, so I'm going to walk through that one more time, and then we will move on. So we went to the Setup tab. We selected the feature called Define Tabs. At the bottom of this big long list, we chose add a tab. We gave that tab a name in the tab description field, and we selected form from the drop-down list of components for that tab. I'm not going to do this again, but and then we click add. And once we're in the tab, we have to configure the data entry form for that tab, and we do so clicking on this gray box below the component dropdown. And then we select the role that we want this tab to display on so that we can reference it, so that we can see what it looks like from a data entry user perspective as we're making updates to the form and playing around with the form. So how did that go for everybody? Are there any questions? Awesome. Okay. So now, just to ensure that that all went smoothly, I'm going to go to people organizations. I am going to look for myself as a staff person and see if my new tab is showing up. Oops. Sorry, my go-to webinar window is in the way. So there it is at the very end. So when you add a new tab, what it's going to do is it's going to show up at the very right of your file. So the way you see the list of tabs from top to bottom determines how they display left to right in Outcome Tracker. So the bottom of the list is going to be the furthest right tab in your site, and you can move things around, and if that's something you want me to show you how to do, just let me know. But otherwise, you'll be wanting to scroll to the very right of your file to access your new tab. And here it is. It looks just like the Case Notes tab, but it's totally different. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I set things up to work as I'm playing around on forms. So I typically keep my people organizations record open on one browser tab. I know we are saying tabs. We're going to be saying tabs a lot today. So in my browser, I've got people organizations open with my staff record open, or a test record. So you could add a new test person to the staff role and work in that record if that works better for you, whatever your preference is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over the activities tab in Outcome Tracker. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to open the link in a new tab. So if I go over to the new browser tab I've opened with the activities list in it, I'm going to open up the form that we created. So by selecting the Cat Sandbox activity, going over to Forms, and then opening up Cat Sandbox. And so what this allows me to do is, under the Activities tab, is create changes and save changes here, and then go back to a record that's displaying those changes and just refresh it. So every time I make a change, I can just click refresh and I can see what it looks like to see if, you know, anything's gone haywire or if it's doing what I'm trying to get it to do. So yeah, so that is essentially the test environment that I work from. And it's worked really well for me because it lets me, one of the most difficult things is being able to play around in Outcome Tracker without interfering with frontline staff who need to do their work in the database. And so when you're making changes right on the forms that staff are using all the time, it can usually result in frustration and chaos, which isn't ideal. So testing first somewhere else is just a really, I've found it just makes the whole process a lot smoother in the long run. So I'm just going to return to our PowerPoint for a second and see sort of where we are. So we've gone through the processes of setting up the test form. And I just want to pause and flag a few things for you to consider when you're setting it up. So when we touched on this a little bit, but when you're setting up your test environment, it's important to think about, well, who else can see this tab and is it going to cause any confusion for them? And if it's going to cause confusion, should I, will communicating with people who can see it be sufficient, or do I need to think about other ways to limit its visibility in your site? And we can touch on those in more detail, or if you want to follow up with me and, we can kind of create a test environment that's a little bit more unique to your site, that's no problem at all. And the other consideration is, will data I enter into this activity somehow get pulled into my aggregate reports? So the way I've set it up here, that should not be the case at all. So we're working with a role that isn't part of the network roles. We have created a unique activity that's not part of the network activities, even though it's using some questions that are standards of the network. So by all accounts, in the reports that are designed in ACWS, none of this information should accidentally cross over into your aggregate reporting, but there may be reports in your own site where that's not the case. So just, keep in mind what might be unique about your shelter site when thinking about how to set up this testing environment. Okay, so I wasn't sure how long that was going to take, so I did put a little moment in here for a break in case anybody needed it, but we're only about half an hour in, so I'm inclined to say let's keep going unless anyone objects. So I'm going to, continue on here. So the first, suite of features we'll look at are focused on ways, from data entry staff's point of view, data entry can be made easier. And most of those features exist in the layout section of the form. So I'll take you through those, but I'll just cover off sort of what came to mind for me as features that are really helpful in improving the flow of data entry, the workflow for staff. So sometimes formatting the number of columns on your form can be really helpful to staff. So I think a good example is an activity like the danger assessment, for those of you who use the danger assessment. That form, or that assessment tool, uses a lot of questions with a standard standard response choices. So it's all, no, yes. It's all the same drop down, and all of the questions essentially are quite standard in terms of how they're entered. There's not a lot of variety there. So it is the type of assessment that can be entered. It doesn't require as much attention to detail as other assessments or tools that get entered in Outcome Tracker. So I think it's an example of a tool that would function really well as one column, and that's how we've set it up in Outcome Tracker, because staff can just kind of, flow right down the form very quickly and hit save at the bottom. So another way to help staff with data entry is to provide additional context or coaching using help text. So those are the little blue question marks that appear next to a question, and if you hover over it, you get a pop-up that has some text in it explaining explaining a bit more about that question or how to respond to it, that type of thing. You can adjust font size you can't adjust the font size of drop-down lists, but you can adjust the font size of a question. So that can be an option too. You may want to design in sections to your form. Break down your form into sections and then use headers to sort of highlight those sections or group questions together. And that can help people with data entry as well. You can do some color coding. So I know some shelters who will color code questions that are entered by some staff versus others. So if more than one program or worker with sort of who provides unique services are working with people, some of their questions may get color coded one way, and other staff's questions may be color coded another way. There may be like supervisor questions that you want to color code, so there are some ways to customize that way. And then there are a few options for how drop-down lists can be formatted. And this, preference varies a lot in terms of how people like to answer drop-downs, but I can show you different ways that you can format a drop-down list. So we're going to start there, and then we'll move into some of the form actions that are available to you. And I'm only going to cover again some, there are probably dozens and dozens of ways you can use form actions to influence data entry. I'm just going to cover a few basics. And if you have any questions about other options, I can certainly do my best to demonstrate those or follow up with you as well. So we'll come back to the form actions in a minute, but right now we're going to go through the layout, the form layout, and play around with some of those features. Okay, so back to my browser. So I'm going to go back to the Activities tab I have open, and I've got my form open as well. And what I'm going to do is go to the Questions option. So on the left here, these are all of the questions within this activity that are available, as well as some system questions that can be added to your form if you want to add questions. So if you want to create a new question, you have to go to the Questions tab here and either create or add the question, and then if you want it to appear on your form, you have to come back to the Forms tab and select it from this list and use the arrows to move it onto the form. But what I want to show you here, and the reason why we're in the questions area, is because we can add text blocks here. And so text blocks are basically just, it's not a question or a field in Outcome Tracker, it's just basically some text that you can add and move around on your form that you can populate with whatever information you want. So I'm going to click here, Add Text Block, and then if I, sorry, I just have to move my GoToWebinar pop-up out of the way. So if I go down to the bottom of the list of all the questions that are already on this form, you'll see that the text block has appeared. And if I click on it now, I can move it up or down the form to position it wherever I want. In terms of, what questions am I creating a header for? So I'm just going to put this one at the very top. I think I'm at the very top, and then click Save. So I'll walk you through that one more time, and then we'll pop over to the people organizations record that we have open and just have a look at sort of what's displaying there now. So again, we're in Forms. I've got the Cat Sandbox form open. I've gone to the questions area of the form. I've clicked Add Text Box. And then I've used the up and down options to position it where I want it on the form, because what I'm going to do is create a header. And then I click Save. So now if I go over to People Organizations and open up my staff record and hit refresh, you'll see at the top here on the left, there is a text block. So it's where I want it is at the top of the form, and now I just need to go in and format it. So we're going to go back to the Activities tab and move from Questions to just below Questions into Layout. So I will, click on Layout. And now what I see are all of those questions that were in that list of questions on my form, and they're displayed in a way that I can format them. So before we go in and format our text block, I think it's important just to explain a couple of things that also happen on Layout. So the way this form is set up right now is that there are 2 columns of questions, and the arrangement of those questions is for them to be side by side with the question right justified. So I'll explain that to you in just a second. But I think it's important to note, because we have 2 columns set up here, and what you'll notice is when I created the text block, it's sort of populating on the left of the form, and then the first question on the form is showing up just to the right of it. So all of the questions here, so I'm going to go back to the Activities tab, are essentially, unless you customize them, going to display left, right, left, right, left, right. But you can customize that when you open up those fields to edit them one by one. So I think I've explained 2 columns, and I'll just explain the default arrangement, because I think this is helpful to know as well. What you can do is set sort of a standard display for questions for your form. And the standard display that's set up right now is that the question description is displayed here on the left, and then the drop-down list, or the field where data for that question can be entered, is positioned very closely to it and just to the right of it. But if we play around with the default arrangement, you'll see that we have a few options to change that. So we can do over under. So I'll just select that for now. And when I select over under, go back to my People Organizations tab and hit refresh. You'll see now that the question description is displayed, and then just below it now is where you can enter data for that question. So this might be preferred for some people, and it may not be for others. It's sort of, there are pros and cons, again, to everything, but I'll just show you the last option that you have as well, which is side by side, but the question left justified. So I'll change that for you. Hit save, then hit refresh again. Now I would say that this is probably, from my point of view, my least preferred format or arrangement for questions, just because I find the more distance between the question description and the data entry field, the more likely there is that visually people might not make the connections, and they could make some data entry errors. So my preferred layout is the side-by-side, right justified, and that's how the form was originally set up. Okay, so what I want to do now, we're working with our text block at the top. So I want to create a header. So you'll notice that when you click on it, essentially a very simplified Word document editing area opens up for you, and there are a number of ways that you can edit this text to appear a certain way. So I'm going to, just for the sake of trying this out, create a header just for the form in general. So I'm going to call this Cats Sandbox form. But you can add an unlimited number of text boxes to your form, and you could use a text box to enter data entry instructions or any sort of reminders around process. You could create sections within your form using different headers, and you'll notice, for instance, on the intake form that we have a demographics area, we have a stability factors area. So you can use these to mimic what your paper forms look like as much as possible, or just provide additional information for people to work with when they're completing their data entry. So again, I've typed in the title, and now I can highlight it. I can bold it here just below that top row. I can use a standard font format for it. So if you have a number of headers on your form and you want them all to display the same way, they could all be header number 3. And it will adjust the font size and whatever else. So sorry, the font size and the boldness of the text. You can also just choose a custom font size for yourself if that's preferred. There are font families here that you can play around with. And just another one that I'll show you is font colors. So you can, so let's say, in keeping with the ACWS theme, why don't we make this purple? Oh, I need to highlight it first, sorry. So I can make it purple. Oops, that was the wrong one, sorry. Let's do that. Oh, I see. Just one sec. This is the text color here, sorry about that. There. Oh no. Here, undo. There we go. Okay, so this is text color. This is background color. There. Okay. And we can also change the span. So you'll remember that we have 2 columns set up for our form. So if I want the title of my form to appear in the center, I need to change the span of that text blocks to be 2 columns, and that means it'll span the top of the whole page and not just the left column or the right column. Okay, so I'm going to click Save, and then go back to my People Organizations tab and just see how that change has appeared on my form. See if I'm happy with it. Okay, so it's still appearing on the left here, which means that I forgot to center it, but you'll see that because it's set up to span 2 columns, that this type of program question has now been moved to the left and below the text block, which is where I want it to be. So I'll just go back to the Activities tab and align my title to be centered on the page, and then click Save. Okay, so there we go. We've got a title in the bottom, or in the center of the top of the form. Are there any questions about that, about any of the other ways we can customize text here? Okay. So I'm going to close, if I click on text block again, I'm going to close that editing section for the text block. And now I'm going to move into some of the questions that we can play around with formatting. So I'm going to move to the type of note question a little bit further down. So again, for how the question displays, you'll still have the option to customize. So if I wanted to, make this blue or change the font size or italicize it or do any number of things to the text, I can do that here, but it's important to note that it's only the question wording that will be customized. So you can't change how this, how the font will appear here. You can emphasize alternatives from the drop downs, but you can change how the question displays. And that includes, elaborating on what it says there. So the question itself is called type of note, but you could, edit the display for that question if that's something that's helpful to you. But it's important to note that you don't want to influence how that question will be answered in a way that's different from the name of the question itself. So you don't want to call type of note like type of transportation, because that would completely change the context of that question. But you may want to call it, type of contact with a woman, maybe, just as an example. So you can certainly do that type of customizing here as well. But if we go down below where the display description gets edited, I'll just highlight a few things. So for this question, you'll see that there's the option to change the arrangement. So we talked about how we can set a default arrangement for the form, and what that means is it sets the way that all questions will appear on the form unless they are individually customized to appear differently. And that's where this is where we can individually customize questions to appear differently. So if I choose not to use the default arrangement, but I choose to use over under for this question, I can select that here. That's no problem. I can also choose to have this question span more than one column. So I may want this question to appear on its own at the top of the form. Or what I might want to do is bump another question so that it appears on the left of the form, and I can do that by going to the question that appears before it on the form and setting it to be 2 columns. So I'm just going to choose a good example of that. So for instance, what we've done here is the note entered by is existing on its own, like there's no question over here to the right of it. And that has put the date of note over on the left and the time of note, which were sort of 2 questions that have a relationship between each other, on the next row, and they display left to right. So I hope that, I know that's kind of confusing, but the total span essentially can allow you to move questions that have like a logic flow or a relationship between each other, so that the primary question will display on the left and then the questions that follow it can display on the right. So that's another helpful way to use this total span option here. So you'll notice as well that we have a help text box. And I reference this as a really great way to add a bit of additional information without cluttering up your forms. And conveniently, there is an example here. of what a text box or a help text box looks like. So if you hover over the blue question mark, you'll get a little bit of information about, what this feature does. So for the type of note, I may want to give some direction about how that's answered. So I can say, select the manner of contact, used to meet with the woman or her family. So just as an example. So I can enter that information here. I can, again, customize it in terms of font size, display, color, and then I can click Save. So I'm going to go back to my record now and refresh. And next to my type of note question, I have that little bit of added detail for staff. So the a nice thing about using the help text is that if you rely solely on text boxes or text blocks to add instructions, it sometimes can add to the appearance of a form being really long and onerous for data entry staff. So it's nice to be able to provide more information to staff in a way that doesn't necessarily clutter up the form. And then it's just a matter of training your colleagues to hover over this little bit of detail to get the information they need. So I'm just going to show you one more feature that we can look at for this question. And that is how to render the drop-down list. So right now, if I go back to the People Organizations tab, I can show you what it means. So this is a drop-down list. So it means that you have to click on the arrow and then select from a list that drops down which value you want from the list. But there are other ways that this can be displayed. So we can render as a drop-down list or a radio list. So if I select radio list and hit save, and then go back to People, Organizations, and refresh. Now my type of note, all the values are displayed here. And it's just a matter of clicking on the value that's preferred. And I'll show you as well just one more option, which is the horizontal radio list, which is essentially the same. But the options are displayed left to right next to the question display. So yeah, I would say that a few things about playing around with the way that you render your drop-down lists. Radio lists are great for drop-down lists that don't have a ton of options on them. But I would suggest that for questions like the note author, where you might have, 25, 30 values on that list, that it doesn't really make sense for that to be displayed, for all of those values to be displayed on your form. That just kind of can be overwhelming and can really clutter things up. But for those shorter lists, for some staff, it's really quite nice to just have to click and select from a list that's already being displayed. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I think, take about 5 minutes and let you all play around with these features. And again, if you have any questions, I'm going to stay here, and please send your questions and we can revisit some of the features. But I think taking 5 minutes or so to play around with the questions on this form is probably a good use of your time right now. So let's play around until about maybe 7 or 8 minutes passed, and then we will jump into the next section of customization options for your forms. Okay, so I hope that went well. No questions came up, so I think we'll dive right into the next section. I'm just, forgive me, but going to go back to my PowerPoint so that I keep track of my place. So we've looked at drop-down formats, color coding, help text, columns, and font size. So now we're going to look at form actions, calculations, and then also display queries. And just a caveat, I'll just let you know how they work. We're not going to build one. That would be a whole 3-hour training probably on its own, but I think it's helpful for you to know that that option exists to you if you want to reach out to Christoph and I and explore ways that this can be implemented on your site. So, okay. So form actions also take place on the form. So down towards the bottom, you'll see the section called form actions. And so essentially, these are business rules that can apply logic to data entry fields. And this is helpful sometimes because it can be very straightforward that when question A is answered a certain way, question B will always be answered the same way. And you can apply those rules here, and then it saves staff from having to answer a question that is answered the same all the time. So I'll show you, I'm just going to return to the form here and see. What a good example would be. I was thinking a really good example would be like program name and type of program, because a lot of shelters have program name questions and the type of program question, which is the ACWS standard. But what I'll probably do here is just sort of show you how it works. Oh, here we go. We do have program name. Awesome. Okay, perfect. So here's what I'm going to do. And I apologize if I've mentioned this already, but there are many, many, many ways to use form actions, and I'm just going to show you some basics as a sampler. And we can sort of go from there if there's an appetite to try out more complex ones. But my blood pressure goes up because this is a very finicky process, and sometimes it doesn't, it's a lot of trial and error, and to do this with an audience is a little bit stressful. But I'll go through maybe a few of these and explain to you what they mean, and then we will try out a couple. So when then. So when then basically means when question A is answered a certain way, then question B will always be answered a certain way. And so you can use this statement in the context of what I just said. So when type of program is emergency or second stage residential, then program name will always be residential. Or in the case of your shelters, you may have unique program names for your different shelter types, and you can set up that automation so that when you answer one question one way, it will be answered automatically another way. Or another question will be answered automatically in its own way. When then else is very similar, except what it's saying. So we use this one often with hiding or displaying questions. So when one question is answered a certain way, we want another question to be available to have data entered on it. But if that first question isn't answered in the way that we've indicated, then we want that second question to be hidden altogether. So it's sort of saying there are two conditions we want to address in this one form action. There's sort of the positive condition of like, yes, do this when this happens, but otherwise we want this to happen. So that might be well explained or maybe not, but yeah. We can show warnings on fields. We can show pop-up warnings. We can show errors. This is a place where we can require a field, and some of these ones we'll touch on more in kind of the preventing data entry errors because they're great. They're great for that. We can set a field to initialize to a certain number. So say there's you know, a certain type of case note that's delivered always takes a standard amount of time. It's 30 minutes, or you know, you book 90-minute intake assessments, and so if intake assessment is chosen from the type of services provided, that means it will always be a 90-minute session. I doubt that's the case, but you can initialize or set a field to appear with a certain number based on other conditions. And then a lot of these I'm going to not delve into in too much detail because they get a little bit complicated to explain. But I think a good starting point for us is to try out the when-then form action. So when we're creating a form action, this area is called the command builder. So you're commanding the form to do certain things for you. And the first step is to select the command that you want to use. And in this case, we're going to choose when then. Okay, so when, and we'll move on to the first drop-down list that's available to us. When, and we're looking at all the different types of expressions. So expressions refer to essentially the kind of question that it is. So we've got numeric questions, we have text fields, we have drop-down lists, we have multi-select lists, or we can have groupings of a number of questions. But we'll focus on kind of those first four because I think they're the most straightforward. So we're interested right now in a list expression because the two questions that I'm referring to, the program name and the type of program, are both drop-down questions. So now that I've selected the type of expression, I'm going to choose the first field. So this is, you know, when question A is a certain way, then question B will be a certain way. So we're working on question A right now. So now all of the drop-down lists that are available on this form will appear in a drop-down list for me. And I'm going to choose type of program. So I've said when the list type of program equals, does not equal. In list means when more than one option from that list is selected. So it's basically saying when emergency residential or second stage residential, that's when I would use in list, and that's the option I'm going to use here. There's also not in list, is empty, or is not empty, and I think those are straightforward. So you may want to have certain commands happen when a question is left blank, and you can totally set that up using when-then statements. So in our case, though, I'm going to choose in list. So now I have the option to choose more than one value from that list. And as I mentioned, I'm going to choose emergency and second stage. So I'll just take you back through what the command is saying so far. So essentially, I'm saying when my list type of program equals either emergency residential or second stage residential, I want the form to do the following. And now I move on to this next drop down. And again, I've got all of the same options here that were in that first list. But what I want to do is choose
initialize, no, I want to choose set a list field. So I want to, when those options are selected, I want to set another list to look a certain way. So I'm going to choose that field, and you'll remember now I'm addressing the program name. So I chose type of program, I set the conditions, and now I'm choosing program name, and I'm going to select the option that I want to automatically appear when type of program equals emergency or second stage. And in the case of my list, it's going to be residential. And I'm going to click Save. Okay, so I'm going to go to the form, the People Organizations tab here, and I'm going to look, refresh the form, and see how my form action is performing. So if I go to emergency residential, you'll see that the program name question is now automatically set to residential. If I go to outreach follow-up now, you'll see that it stayed at residential, and so that's kind of the limitation. Or I guess maybe one thing to consider when using this is that if somebody makes a mistake and initializes that question, they'll have to uninitialize it. What I could do though is set up another form action that says, okay, but when type of program equals emergency in second stage, then I want to initialize this form action to be outreach follow-up. And then that wouldn't happen. So maybe that's helpful to do right now, because I was going to walk you through the process again anyway, just to clarify, but why don't we do it again, but do it with outreach follow-up for the same questions. So we're back down here to a new command, and we're going to choose when then again. So we've got when. Our list expression, so if we're referencing a drop-down list as our question A, we're going to choose a list expression. We're then going to be given the full list of options of drop-downs that are available on the form to apply this expression to. So I'm going to choose type of program. Because I want to apply the conditions to more than one value on the drop-down list, I'm going to choose in list. And now I'm going to choose emergency and second stage outreach follow-up. And I'm going to say, okay, so when these options are selected from my type of program question, I am going to set my list field and choose program name from the options, and then choose outreach follow-up. Okay, so let's refresh again. So we've got two blank questions now. So if I choose emergency residential, it's going to default to residential, the program name. If I choose outreach follow-up from my type of program question, now my program name is going to automatically populate as outreach follow-up. So it worked. So again, just something to consider, you know, that like these introducing form actions, from the administrator's point of view, it takes some time. So it, you know, setting them up can take time, especially as you're getting more comfortable using them. But I think from the point of view of staff, like when my bias in working in Outcome Tracker is that I'm sensitive to the fact that a lot of staff don't love doing data entry. It's not like the highlight of their job. Some people enjoy it. A lot of people don't. And so there, from my point of view, there is a lot of value in putting the time in to design the forms
improve the experiences of staff, because I think generally the data they do have to enter will be of better quality if they're not burnt out with the volume of data entry they have to do. And when there are instances where questions can be automatically populated, I think that that's a really great, straightforward way to simplify the workload for frontline staff. But that's, you know, my point of view, and that you know, each of your shelters have to kind of find that balance on their own, because it's not always as straightforward as just, you know, you taking 10 hours out of your work week to set this stuff up. So yeah. Are there any questions about that particular form action? Does that, I'm feeling nervous that there are no questions, because it could mean that I'm explaining things really well, or it could mean that this is all very confusing, which it is. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and see if any questions come in, and then we'll go to how to apply an error. Awesome. Okay, so there are a few ways to apply an error to a field. So oh, thanks, Charlene. Charlene just gave me some affirming feedback. I appreciate it. Okay, so how to apply an error. So there are a few ways to flag errors, and it kind of depends on what the error is. So I'm just thinking of, let me look at the form and see. Terry, is there a specific error you're interested in? Like, can you think of an example I could build a form action from for you? Because there's sort of, I mean, you can apply errors like, okay, I left this question blank. That's an error. So there are ways to address those kinds of errors. There could be, you know, somebody entered emergency outreach and then chose residential as their program name, and that's a different type of error. Oh, missing data, that's a great one. Oh, okay, questions are coming in. So Terry, I'm going to get to the example you provided in just a second. I have a question that the program name isn't appearing in the list field, and that could be that on your forms it's not there. So kind of the history between the type of program question and the program name question is that we developed the type of program, and this is a question with standard drop-down lists that are used by everybody in the same way, that reflect how your programming fits into the provincial funding categories. So we've got like emergency shelters that provide emergency residential services. But some shelters, for instance, so like Win House actually has 2 or 3 emergency shelters, different shelters. And each of those shelters has a distinct name. And so they needed their own question to assign the program names to those different emergency shelters. So from ACWS's point of view, it's all emergency, and we don't really, it's not material to us whether it's happening at one shelter versus another. It's all the same type of programming. But from Win House's point of view, they want to be able to track what's happening in each of those shelters. And so they need their own program to track that. So you may not need to have both. And so it may not appear on both your forms. If you would like to have a program name question, we could certainly set that up in your site. And in terms of playing around, since you don't have that program name question, I think you could test out the theory of that form action using any other drop-down question with values. So you could say, okay, so when I choose emergency outreach follow-up, I want the following types of services to automatically get selected in another question.
question, for instance. So if that doesn't feel realistic right now, we can certainly follow up and play around with these form actions together, kind of one-on-one. So I apologize. I thought that would be an example that was relevant to everybody, but I was mistaken. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the question about how to apply an error. So for instance, missing data. So let's say that so again, there are two ways to, okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll show how to populate an error. And what this error will do is show up when you go to save the form and that data was left blank. But there are also other kind of, this is where we go down the rabbit hole a little bit of there are sort of other ways. So you could also set up, if you know a question needs to be answered, you can set up an alert like we already have here. So type of program is displayed already as an ACWS priority field. So it's highlighted before data entry even starts to happen, as like this is a field we would really like you to complete. So I hope that when we move on to preventing data entry errors, that it'll kind of become clear that there are many roads to Rome, I guess, in terms of addressing things like data entry mistakes. So you can do preemptive form actions on your form, or you can do ones that kind of flag the errors after the fact. So let's try, we'll play around with the types of services. Question, and we'll do a couple of examples here. So I'm going to stick to the when then. Let's see. Like what we could do, I'll show you actually, I'll start with showing you a preemptive way of doing it. So show warning on field. Show warning on field. So if I select my field and we go to type of service provided in the course of contact, what I can do is just display some text on that question. So show the warning on the field. So I can say must be completed at every contact with the one, and click save. So now when I go back to my form, oh, I see. Okay, bear with me, Terry. I realize now that I'm not showing you what you're after, but it's okay. This will be good for everybody else, and then we'll get to what you want. So we have here now a warning. So we've got our little warning message, must be completed at every contact with a woman. So that's flagged for people. So that's one way to sort of preemptively do it. The other way, so I'm just going to delete this form action now. So what I did is very simply just show a warning on a field. Choose the field and then select text. So I'll show you again. If you select text, it just basically gives you a text box that you can customize and put whatever sort of message you want in there. So that's a really straightforward way to do it. The difference between show warning and show error is that the error shows up as red here, so it's just a little bit more aggressive. So what Terry was looking for is really more of a when then statement. So when multi-select expression. So we're still working with that types of services question. So that one's a multi-select, which means it's a box here and you can choose multiple response choices from it. So when the multi-select expression, now I'm going to choose my multi-select type of service. And let's say it's empty. Perform the following. Let's show error. So now we've selected show error, and we have that same option again. And I like the text personally. The reason why I like the text is that you can be very specific in your wording of the warning or error. And like for us at ACWS, we have to be sensitive to the fact that, like, so I'm nobody's boss in a shelter, but my goal is to sort of help us keep our collective data performing well. So it's just like a sensitive sort of place to be, and you may feel that way with your peers, your colleagues, that you're not necessarily a supervisor. And so the way that you can use language to sensitively encourage people to address errors can go a long way in terms of, it's a funny sort of place to be when you're an administrator of something, because you're not always somebody's boss, but you have an accountability and you need people to support you in that accountability. So we might say staff are encouraged to document services at all contacts with the woman. So that's some nice, gentle language, I think. Okay, so I've saved that. And now what I will do is refresh. So, oh, you know what though? I was hoping that it would just show up at the end when we saved the form, but it showed up automatically. So I'm just going to try something here, because it could just be because we're working within the same. I'm just going to move to another tab and then move back to this tab and see if that alert's showing up. So this is what I was getting at, like form actions. There's a lot of playing around. So I frequently don't get it right the first time. And yeah, so this may not necessarily be what you want, Terry, but it sort of gives you the idea. I'm just thinking about what the, let's see, I'm just going to back up here. When why don't we try show error on field? Well, no. Oh, there we go. So it might be a when then else. Let's play around with when then else. And this may or may not get us to where we need to go. So you were thinking of an empty field. Terry, can I unmute you? And can we chat about, I feel like I'm maybe not quite getting what you'd like to touch on. So maybe could you provide an example?
Oh, okay. On a lot of my call contacts, I have a lot of errors in certain areas. Like one of them might be they forgot to put the gender down, or yes, they forgot to put types of services provided. yeah, there's just several areas that seems to get forgotten. You know, how was contact made? Was it made by phone or in person?
Right.
So, and referrals. Referrals is a big one. You know, they forget to put no referral or something. What I was looking at was, you know, before they could even close it or
Hmm.
something, and they have to go back. You know, sometimes you get those forms on the internet, you got to fill them out.
Yeah.
Frustrated because you have to keep going back and figuring out where it is you forgot to fill in. Something
Yes.
along that line.
Okay.
Would
Yeah. So
save a
that's,
lot of grief for sure.
yeah. So,
And
um,
you know, constantly bringing them in, going, okay, do you guys see where the mistake is?
yeah. No, this is
Yeah.
a really common issue.
Well,
And
sometimes they're in a hurry and it just gets overlooked, which is understandable.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So that's
Um,
kind of what I'm looking for. Like, I would like to just put things where the most common mistakes are on my form. So then, you know, they have to go back and go, oh, yeah, I forgot to do that. You know,
yeah.
so just a
So
gentle reminder, more or less.
a gentle reminder. Awesome.
Missing or, you know, incomplete or whatever.
Yeah.
Or a star or whatever. I don't know. Just something just to show them where it is missing.
Okay. Yeah, that's
And
helpful.
yeah, thank you.
So this kind of gets into, so I'm just going to pop back into our PowerPoint because I think we're sort of going to be pretty settled into form actions from here on out. So I'm maybe deviating from um, the plan, but it makes sense to just sort of stay in form actions and play around. So um, what we're getting into is kind of dealing with data entry errors now. Um, so what I'm going to do is talk about requiring fields and alerts, which are ways to prevent data entry errors. And then I think we'll take a bit of a break and then look at a few others and talk about, well, I don't know. I actually don't know that the flow is going to flow as I'd intended because this is, again, all very nuanced. But so there are kind of two ways to get to what Terry's after. There's requiring fields, which means that you can set it up so that a form can't be saved until a question's answered. There are a lot of pros and cons to that approach. And then the other one is kind of the way that we've worked, which is just using alerts, like we were just playing around with, which is a bit gentler and sometimes makes more sense in the context that many of you are working. So the big issue, like requiring fields is a great tool for data entry quality. When it is feasible that all of the information that's collected on the form is answered at the same time. So like the danger assessment is a great example. You're not going to necessarily complete a danger assessment, bit by bit. You're typically going to complete your assessment on paper and then go to Outcome Tracker and enter it. Information that's collected on the intake form is a little bit different in that, some basics will get collected, within a few hours of a woman entering shelter. But there's a lot of information about that woman's experience and her background that will be collected over time as a relationship is built with her. So it's, I don't know that many shelters collect all of a woman's trauma history within an hour of meeting her. And so it wouldn't make sense to make it impossible for staff to save a form in those cases because we need that form to have the flexibility to work with the practical side of data collection in those cases. Does that make sense? Like, yes, we want data quality, but we need the form to work for its intended purpose too, which is to collect information as it becomes available to us. So I'll show you how to require
a field. It's a very straightforward form action. And then I guess I just present it with the caveat of like, this is a form action that should be used with a lot of care. So it shouldn't just be, you know, a unilateral decision, unless maybe your director wants to go that route. But I think it can be a big source of frustration for your colleagues if it's not implemented with some thought and care to how they use that form to document their work. So like case notes is another example of a place where I wouldn't require a lot of fields because it's data entry that kind of, you know, is a little bit more user driven. It's intended to support frontline work. It's not so much a research tool like the danger assessment is, I guess. I mean, a danger assessment, you know what I mean. So, okay. So again, we're going to go with multi-select expression. I'm going to stick with that types of services. So I'm going to select type of service from the field options that show up for me. Oh wait, sorry, we're not doing a when then. Sorry, scratch that. Okay, so from our commands, we're actually going to require a field. So it's very straightforward. You just select require a field and then you choose your field from that list, and it can be any question. And click save. So I'll just close this error out. So now if I go to save my form, oh, that shouldn't have worked. I must have put something in there. Oh, this field is required. So it did allow me to save it. That's interesting. Interesting. So that might have changed. So this to share. So I'm going to try this one more time because that is not how I have experienced this form for this feature in the past. So if I go to click save, there we go. Missing required fields, form cannot be saved. And then we have the alert that this field is required. So now if I enter some data for it and hit save, the form can be saved and that alert goes away. So that's the most straightforward way to do that kind of coaching of like, this absolutely has to be answered. And if it's not, you basically can't save any of your work until it is. So now I'm going to use a when then else statement to do kind of that other option, kind of the softer option. And this is these are the form actions that we use very frequently in outcome trackers. So when then else basically says, you know, what I'm going to use this statement for is I'm going to say when types of services is empty, show an error on this field, and then otherwise don't show an error on the field. So it's sort of setting up some alternatives. So I'll go back to multi-select expression. I will get my list of multi-select questions. And then when it's empty, I will show an error on the field. And I'll choose the same question. So one thing to note is that these statements can also communicate logic between questions. So for instance, like if when types of services equals intake assessment, then another question might get an alert or an error on it. But we won't necessarily go into that into too much detail. I just want to flag that for you as something we could follow up on as a more complex way of using form actions. So now I'm going to show an error in the field. I'm going to use the text option to put please complete at least one service per contact. Okay. So that's what I've done. I've said, okay, so when types of service provided is empty, show an error that says please complete at one service. Otherwise, so we're going to skip this. We're going to jump down to the otherwise. Otherwise, clear an error from the field. Type of service. There, so I said, okay, when it's empty, show this error. Otherwise, clear the error. So that means that when I go to the form, it's going to default. We're going to go to a new version of the form because this one has data in it. But what it's going to do is it's going to default as being, alerted to. So we haven't done any data entry on this form yet. But what I see is that, okay, this is a question that I have to do at least some data entry for. And then as soon as I do some data entry for it, the alert or the error will go away. I just want to see if it'll go back to, and now if I clear data out of there, my error alert is back. So it's highlighted for you. And that's the same way that this field is working as well. So because there's no data in it, it's defaulting as an error. But as soon as I enter something for it, it's going to settle down, hopefully. Oh, we don't have a when then else. Yeah, so this is just a when then. So that's a good, maybe this is helpful to highlight. That's the difference between a when then and a when then else. So a when then will just kind of automatically leave that feature there. A when then else will say, like, under conditions A, do this, but under conditions B, do something else. So yeah. Okay, so why don't we take a 10-minute break? For those of you who want to play a little bit, please play. For those of you who want to get more coffee or stretch your legs, please do that. And we will reconvene at 11.
Hi everybody, I'm back. I'm just going to jump back into the PowerPoint because I think, we're kind of moving back and forth between, making data entry easier and preventing errors. But I just wanted to close the loop for myself on some of the features we talked about with auto-populating fields and that type of thing. And some of the form layout things that we discussed, because I really, it's great to know about these tools, but I think it's also important to talk about how to make decisions around using them. So I wanted to share my own insights into, weighing the pros and cons of each, and some of the things that I consider before I decide for myself which features to use in different situations. So in reference to the layout features we talked about, so the preferences for number of columns, for font sizes, for the use of color, these can be very individual preferences and can be very time-intensive changes to make to your form. So when you deviate from what is standard in Outcome Tracker, you're doing it all manually, and you're designing in future work for yourself if you ever make changes to that form down the road. So I always factor that into my decision, just to make sure that whatever changes I'm making really do benefit all the staff that are implicated in them, or at least the majority of the staff that will be affected by them. So yeah, I just encourage you to kind of keep that in mind before you dive in and do a lot of these manual design changes, because yeah, it takes forever. It's really finicky, fussy work, and you just want to make sure it's worthwhile, I guess, before you tackle it. Yeah, and drop-down formatting, I mentioned this already, and I just want to flag it again, and you will have this PowerPoint to keep as a reference for yourselves. But I would say the number of values on a list are really, it makes a big difference. So it's nice to play around with, like, well, what is your max number of drop-down values that you'll use for a radio list? And I would play with it, because you can really see on a form how it can start to get really cluttered if there are too many options displaying at once on your form. Okay. So around the auto-populating, so you'll remember we did that when type of program equals this, I want program name to equal this. So just a few things to think about there when you're reflecting on those features and thinking about using them is how consistent is the relationship between these responses. If it's very consistent, go for it. If there are some exceptions to these relationships, is it possible to account for them in form actions? And I'll just allude back to, we looked briefly at when, then, else versus when, then. So when, then, those are great form actions when there's just a direct A to B relationship between, two questions. If there are exceptions, those can be designed in using when, then, else statements most of the time. So I think just having a really clear picture of what does this form action really need to do to truly improve data entry and not create the opportunity for new mistakes is just really understanding, okay, these are all the conditions I need to account for when I design my form action before you actually go in and design it. And then, yeah, there's usually a way to account for a lot of nuance when you're designing them. It's just a matter of being prepared with all of those considerations. And then I didn't get to talk about querying, but I just want to show you because it's really, really cool. And it's something, for those of you who work in second stage shelters, it's something that we're going to be using on the acuity scale, and I will be showing some of those staff tomorrow. But in Outcome Tracker, what you can do on a form, if I go back to my Activities tab, And I strongly encourage you guys not to play with this on your own, but to work with us on it. We're still learning about it. It's kind of fussy work, so I just think from the point of view of not wasting time working with us on it, we're very keen to learn more about it and to help you guys use it. But you'll see a section called reports and queries. And what you can do in this section, so the way the acuity scale is working, so I'll just give you guys an overview of it. And actually, maybe I'll show it to you even though it's still under development. Let me open this in a new tab. So the way the acuity scale works, so the acuity scale is an assessment tool that the second stage shelters are using. And it uses information that we collect already about women and their families. And we assign item scores based on, the level of acuity they have in different areas of their experience. So I see. Okay, I need to go to another record and I'll just show you how it works. So the way we're using this tool with that in mind is that on the acuity scale form, there are data entry fields, and then there are fields that are pulled from queries in Outcome Tracker that provide read-only reference information for people. So just to give you an idea, so we have the risk of femicide. So the risk of femicide is a question that'll get scored on the acuity scale, but it is scored based on that woman's total DA score. So this form references a query that's pulling the woman's danger assessment information, and it's provided here as a read-only option on the form, but it can be referenced to then enter data on this form. So there may or may not be, valuable uses that you can think of for this option, but I think it has a lot of potential for us down the road as a network, because there's a lot of information existing. Like I'm sure when you guys are going to complete, case notes, for instance, you're looking at information that's maybe happening elsewhere in a woman's record, and maybe on assessments, that type of thing. So this feature is there. And yeah, you maybe want to query information about her kids, for instance, and have it display somewhere in her record, and you can totally do that. That's like a feature that we are doing a lot of exploring in right now. So yes, I present this to you as something to ponder, and then maybe just to kind of keep watch for as we think about ways that it can be generally used across shelters. So yeah, okay. So back to this. So yeah, is the information I want to query static or subject to change over time? I won't actually dwell on that too much, but okay. So ways to prevent data entry errors. So we looked a little bit at required fields. And as I mentioned, when you add required fields to a form, it's just important to note that that form can't be saved until data for that question is answered. So use with caution. I showed you a couple of options for adding alerts. So just so you know, there are, we looked at sort of text displays, we looked at errors versus warnings, and then we also have the option, you saw also some pop-up bubbles. So there are different ways to communicate importance using those errors and warnings. And just keep that in mind when you think about, well, what will work best with our staff. I am a person who, just full disclosure, when those pop-ups come up, sometimes I don't even read them and I just see the X and I am so happy that the X is there and I close out of it. So I'm not a good candidate for pop-ups, but some of your colleagues might be. So, so two other form actions to prevent data entry errors that I wanted to show you were displaying questions that are relevant only sometimes, and then also putting limits on data that can be entered into numeric fields. So yeah, these are two that I wanted to touch on. And then from there, I kind of just want to open it up. And if there are, you know, specific things you want to play around with in form actions, I can't promise. Like, I'm pretty good at messing around with form actions until I get it to do what I need it to do, but I can't promise you that it's going to be pretty. But I think it's important that we give that a shot if we've got extra time at the end here. So yeah, okay, so what did I say? I said we're going to display or hide questions based on other answers, and then limit values. So let's go back into Outcome Tracker. I'm going to close this. And we will go back to the form actions section. So I'm just going to go back to my form here. I'm going to look for some good examples of questions that so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this form up to only display type of service provided in the course of contact if other, when other is selected from this list, and otherwise I'm going to hide this question. And the way that this helps with data entry quality is that we're basically only making a question available to be entered if it should be entered. And quite often we see if we just have all the questions showing up, and for those of you who have worked in Outcome Tracker a long time, this used to be kind of how we rolled. People will just enter data into questions even if they don't, it doesn't need to be entered there. And then there's a lot of kind of working backwards through that data to like really, it's like a good question or a good example is like the background question. So on the intake form, we've got sort of all of these questions that are related to one another. And one of them is, the first question is, does a woman self-identify as Aboriginal? And then if yes, she would answer some questions. But before we had those form actions in there to hide the questions, a woman might indicate that she's not Aboriginal, but staff would still fill out that, you know, she identified as First Nations. So you can prevent those kinds of mistakes by using this hide or display feature. So the hide and display is essentially a when then else statement. So we are saying, you know, when question A is answered this way, we want question B to do this. Otherwise, we want question B to do this. So I'll choose when then else from my commands. We're looking at a multi-select expression because our question A in this case, the type of service question, is a multi-select question. We're going to choose contains, and then from the drop-down list, hang on, it should have other in it. Oh my goodness, it doesn't. Okay, well, we'll just use another example. So when type of service provided in the course of contact contains safety planning, we want to show a field. And the field we want to show is the type of service provided. And this is, they display in order, so I know, even though I can't see the full question, I do know that this is the sort of if other option. So we're going to show a field. And then I'm going to forget this. So what you can do is you can say, you can, you know, show as many fields as you want. So there might be more option Bs in a scenario than just one question. It could be, you know, when question A is answered this way, I want these 5 questions to show up. And so you can do any number of fields here, so you could, you know, choose as many as you like. In our case, we're only concerned about the ones, so I'm going to delete those. And I'm just going to skip right ahead to otherwise perform the following. So otherwise, I'm going to hide a field. And I'm going to select that same field, type of services if other, and click Save. And so now we'll refresh this page. And you can see that that question is hidden now. So the if other, unless I choose safety planning. And now it displays. So now I can enter data there. But if I choose another one, it's going to be hidden again. So there. So this is a great, this kind of has, this feature has two benefits. It also contributes to those optics to staff of like, you know, we have so many of these questions in the database that are conditional in that way, like, oh, you know, if others are everywhere, or, you know, we've got all these text fields that only need to be available some of the time. So another example might be, you know, cancellation notice, results of contact. And this might not be on your forms, this is on our forms, but attempted but not made. So if, you know, maybe the cancellation notice is only required when the results of the contact are attempted but not made. And so you could hide a ton of questions on your forms. And then staff see fewer questions and the forms appear less daunting and overwhelming. So yeah, so it kind of has that benefit, and then it has the benefit too of like you only get data and questions when you need it. Otherwise, you can't enter any data into those questions. So one thing I just want to point out from a data quality point of view is that the one training piece that needs to accompany is, so for instance, if safety planning is selected, and that means that this question displays and staff enter data here, and then they're like, oh, I didn't provide any safety planning, I'm going to change my option or my response to this first question, that data is still there, even if they change this. So what is important to train staff to do is that, okay, if in those cases, you have to clear out your data here before you change your answer there. Otherwise, you know, we'll still have the same issue of data being populated in a question that it shouldn't really be populated for. So I'll just review that one again. We'll walk through kind of the logic, and then I'm going to show you guys how to put some, I'm just going to do a maximum value on a question, and then we can start playing around with examples for you guys. So, okay. So we're using a when, then, else statement. So we chose when. The type of services provided in the course of contact contains safety planning. We want the following question to display, or we want to show the following fields, and that's the type of services provided if other. And we could add any number of questions to be displayed, so you may have a number of questions that follow from the types of services provided. In this case, we just have one, but I just will remind you guys, you can show any number of fields and hide any number of fields. And then if safety planning is not selected in that first question, then we just want to hide the second question altogether. And so that's what we've chosen here. And then just click Save. The nice thing too is that if the logic in your form action is flawed, it won't let you save it. So I'll just mention that. It can be really irritating sometimes, but it is kind of a nice feature too. So yeah, so that's that. Any questions? Okay, I'm just going to go back to our test form and see a good example. So I'm going to look at task duration in minutes. And I think this is a great question to have like a maximum amount of minutes that can be entered in there. So we're going to go back to form actions, and I'm going to find so I think we're going to use a when then else again for this. And what's going to be different this time is we're going to be selecting a numeric value. So we're going to choose a numeric expression. So when, oops, the field task duration in minutes, and okay, so this is where more complex calculations can happen. So you can put multipliers on numerics, and it's not relevant to what we're doing here, but I just want to point out that's what that is. So we're just going to ignore it for now. But when task duration in minutes is greater than or equal to, and we're going to choose a number because we're going to decide what that number is. So I don't know how worthwhile it is to explain how all of these work, but you could have like a conditional relationship between two numeric fields, and so you could select another field. So like maybe task duration can't be more than travel duration, just hypothetically. You could choose that, but in our case, we're just going to enter a number. And the number I'm going to enter, sorry, it's in minutes, so I have to use my calculator. But I'm going to say, so it doesn't make sense to me that a contract would be longer than a business day. That might not be the case, but I'm just going to kind of make a wild guess here. So 8 times 60. So if this is greater than 480 minutes, because this task is documented in minutes, not hours, I'm going to show an error on the field. And the field I'm going to show that error on is task duration in minutes. And I'm going to say, oops. And again, I'll select text, and that allows me to type in. I know this is getting complicated. We'll review it again. We're going to enter in the text. So contact time cannot exceed a business day in duration. Okay, so that'll be my error message. And then otherwise, I'm going to clear the error from the field. And I'm going to choose that same field and hit save. Okay, so we'll look at it in a second, but I'm just going to walk you through it again because I feel like I was kind of clumsy there in setting that up. But we chose a numeric field for our when statement. So we said when this numeric field, task duration in minutes, is greater than or equal to a number that we decide, and that number is 480, we want to show an error on that field. And so we've selected that field to have the contact time cannot exceed a business day in duration as our error message. And then if that number doesn't exceed 480, we're going to clear the error from the field altogether. So it'll just be left as it is. So we'll hit save. Now let's go see how it works. Okay, So I'm going to put 500 in here and try to save it. Okay. So here we go. So task duration in minutes, contact time cannot exceed a business day in duration. So I have that alert now at least. It still let me save the form. And I don't know if there's a way off the top of my head that we can prevent the form from being saved, but at least that message is there now, that that would be considered an error. If I were to reduce this to 300, oops, then the error message goes away. So yeah, that's how you do that one. Again, it's a little bit complicated. And I think probably the most complicated part is just getting comfortable with what all the references are in terms of, like, you know, getting familiar with the language that's used here for form actions. But once you're, I think, a little bit more familiar and have played around a little bit, it gets quite a bit easier to flow through, kind of, okay, to work with the logic. Yeah, when you have a certain level of comfort with all the definitions that go along with form actions. So. Okay, so I'm going to just review again, because I have those things to think about. So I'd like to just touch on those, and then we've got half an hour left to either play around, try some of these things out, work from examples. Like if you guys have an example you want to share and tackle together, I'd love to do that. So let's look. So just some things to think about with this last set of form actions we looked at. So do I have a clear understanding of the workflow relationships between questions? So it's very important to set your form actions up in a manner that they don't interfere with one another. So when you find yourself applying more than one form action to the same question, you kind of, I think it's important to take a step back and really think about, okay, well, what's the workflow that needs to be accounted for before I design out my form actions? Because sometimes you're hiding a question based on how one question was answered, but it may be that that limitation is interfering with the need for that question to be answered under different circumstances. So I can't think of a specific example, but just keep in mind, like, there's a lot of planning before you just dive into designing form actions. You really do want to plan them out and make sure that the workflow is totally accounted for when you build them into your forms. And then the second big thing to think about is, like, what are my priorities for providing guidance to data entry? So it's very unlikely that you'll have so many form actions. Like once you get to, like, we've got some, so like the new DA form has like probably 100 form actions on it. And you can get to the point where a form's performance is impacted, but I don't think it's likely that you guys will get there. But I just want to flag that for you because again, it's just really thinking about the worthwhileness of making these changes and putting the work into making these changes. Like, make sure that the value is there for you and for your agency, because down the road you just might find yourself bogged down by form actions that aren't necessarily doing a lot for you, and they're just slowing down your forms or your systems. So and I just put together a little slide. This is me sharing what I've learned from all the mistakes I've made over the years in messing around as an administrator in various databases. So I impart this information to you and just letting you know that I have made all these mistakes. So take the time to get a very clear understanding of the issue or goal you're trying to address. in your database. So both from the point of view of improving data entry and from preventing data entry errors. Sometimes training is actually the best solution. So if training is an option, or just, working around helping staff understand what questions mean better, that, just keep in mind that it's not always just as simple as making changes in your database, that there could be other sources of the issue that need to be addressed as well. So identify all the options available to you and weigh the pros and cons with somebody else's input from your organization, or with us. Like Christoph and I, you guys work at your shelter and you work with your staff there, and then times that by 50, and that's what Christoph and I are doing. So we've seen a lot. We've made a lot of mistakes. We've tested out a lot of things, so we can be a great sounding board for you if you just want to weigh the options. But I think getting input from your colleagues who will be doing the data entry is a very important step to take before you go in and make changes, major changes to your forms. We've set up a testing environment for you, and I encourage you to test everything out. And you should know, actually, I'm going to show this to you really quickly. So I'm just going to go back into, like, if you want to test out changes to questions that aren't in your sandbox already, or whatever your test environment is, you can add them to the form, and that's no problem. So down at the bottom, so if you're in your activity, which is where I am, so I'm in Cat Sandbox, we were just in forms, now I'm going over to the questions tab. All of the questions in my database are here and available to be added. So if you want to pull some questions from the intake form to play around with, you can totally select them and then add them. Just click add. So you add them to your activity, and then you just go back to forms here. Choose your form, go to questions, and then select them from the left. So they'll show up on the left here, and you can just arrow them over and they'll be on your form. And then you can play with them. So you can, test out, you could pull in DA questions if you want to test them out. You can pull in questions from the discharge form, anything you like, and then play around with how those form actions will perform in those specific questions. And that's really the intent of having this separate activity. So pull in whatever questions you need to play around and do your thing. But then I would say, when you've tested them, if you can get a colleague to test them out too, that's always really helpful. They might see something that you don't see. And like, I know I have the bias, I get really excited about having learned something in Outcome Tracker, and I want to just use it, and that can be my bias when making changes in the database. So having somebody provide maybe a bit more of a neutral perspective on how well that new thing is actually going to work is really, really valuable. When you're making these changes, I would communicate as much as possible with your colleagues who will be affected by the change. And think about timing of changes, and there are a lot of things to consider. So I would just say, the more you communicate, the more information you'll have to make the changes in a way that is sensitive to everybody affected by them. And then I would also say, set up a timeline for you to check in on how well that change is actually performing as it was supposed to. So it just might not be the right change. So if you're still getting the same errors a month later, you maybe want to look at another option. So yeah, so that's the formal part of what I had planned for today. Does anybody want to try something out together, like make a suggestion for a specific form action that we can play around with as a group. I'm just going to give a minute in case anybody's typing. And then otherwise we'll say farewell in a few minutes. Yes, so this is a good question. So Charlene has asked, is this the area that we can use to create electronic signatures if we are going paperless? So if you are going paperless, so where we are right now, so we explored an electronic signature option with VistaShare like a year ago. We did a big, every couple of years we do a satisfaction survey. We approached VistaShare with kind of our wish list for improving the database, and one of them was the electronic signature capability. And I don't think that what they've been able to put together for us is would meet the standard, the legal requirements of an electronic signature, but there are ways to put user-specific stamps on an activity. So case notes is a great example of a place where you might want to have that. And how that would happen, Charlene, is through the querying feature that I mentioned very briefly. So what we can do is query the user information of whoever created that enrollment, and we can have it display on the case note. So instead of you typing in your name, Charlene, or choosing Charlene from a dropdown, what it's going to do is it's going to pull the fact that you were the person signed in to Outcome Tracker who made those particular updates to a data entry form. So we can talk about that further offline if you like. But yes, that's sort of the extent of what we have right now as far as electronic signatures. But the reason why I won't get into too much detail is because there's a pretty complex query we would have to build to pull that information, and I don't think that we could do it. But it might be a good webinar subject, actually. Maybe I'll put that in the parking lot as a future webinar idea. Okay, well, I think that covers it for today. As always, well, I'll just remind you that the PowerPoint is available for you to download in the handout section. So before you sign off, if you just want to download that, it may be helpful to have to refer back to. We'll have the video up, I'm hoping at the end of next week, and we'll send you guys an update because we've got a number of videos that are ready to be uploaded for the trainings we've done over the last month or so. And then also, if you would be so kind as to fill out the evaluation. So when I close the webinar, you'll get a link to an evaluation, and we are committed to providing you guys with the best training possible. So your feedback is really important to us. And yeah, I appreciate you taking about 10 minutes or so, maybe not even, to fill that out. So yeah, if anything comes up and you would like to connect, I hope you all have my email address, and if not, you can ask for me in the OT support email, and I'm more than happy to set up a time and tackle your form design questions one-on-one after today's call. So yeah, I hope you guys all enjoy a beautiful sunny day, and we'll talk soon. Take care.